we have to go to all these points because they're all important, what can we do to alleviate that for a student that's just trying to find something, or a parent that is looking for information about financial aid? What we try to do is say, how can we make that easier? That's something we try to look for. We try to look for those solutions that are wins for the client.
When students are coming into the school for the first time at the first semester, the first week, there's an influx of traffic. There's people signing up for classes. There's a variety of things happening all at once. How do you start to think about that? How do you start to think about scale for an institution like that?
When you have one site that can take advantage of that bursting up to 110, or if you decide you want to do a multi-site and pack it with 100, 200, 500 sites, on our end, it's still treated as a single site. So it's going to have that same burst limit of 110 workers. How can we solve for some of the things they want to
do? Welcome to Impressive Hosting, where we seek to uncover the core tenets of great WordPress hosting. I am your host, Jesse Friedman, and with me today is Aaron Ware from Linchpin and Josh Good from WP Cloud at Automatic. Welcome, guys.
Thanks for having us, Jesse.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you. Aaron, why don't we start with you and just do a little brief introduction? Tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us where you live, what you're interested in, what you're working on.
Sure. My name is Aaron Ware. I own a smaller digital agency called Linchpin. We're 100% remote, but the company is based out of Little Rhode Island, where I live, and actually, Jesse, you live as well. We're, representing Little Rhodey today. We work on. We're pretty boutique. We're pretty diverse in the clients we work with. Everything from Fortune 100s to smaller mom and pop stores, brick and mortar stores, to startups, and even with this conversation, higher education. And they're higher education at all different sizes of universities and institutions.
Nice. Thanks. Joshua, why don't you jump in?
Yeah, so I serve as kind of the technical solutions engineer for WP Cloud. That's a bundle of partner success, technical account management, sales engineering, getting down to integration engineering with our partners. So kind of across the board, just helping people integrate and get the most out of the WP Cloud platform. And I'm from here in Tennessee, the southeast corner of Tennessee. Any further south, you're in Georgia. Any further east, you're in North Carolina. So it's a beautiful, beautiful area. I'm very grateful that I get to do all this from here. The big Automatic dreams right here from rural Tennessee.
But you don't spend all of your time online writing code and doing technical things, right? You also manage a farm?
Yeah, we do a little bit of farm work out here. It is a rural area, so there's a lot of opportunities for that. We've pulled back on some of that operation. But yeah, farming, a bit of craft beer brewing. That's actually one of my past careers too. A little in between of a tech company I worked for sold out. I had an opportunity to join a brewery, did that. Still do it on the side, just a little bit non-professionally. So yeah, I get away from the computer when I can, but the draw of the things that we do Automatic kind of keep me at that computer a lot.
Yeah, very cool. So a lot of people don't know this, but Aaron and I go way back. We met in 2005, so that's almost 20 years ago now. I joined BZ Results in Rhode Island it was my first job after college. Or I should say my first real job after college. And at that time, Aaron was, what was your role? You were like the head of engineering?
I think my real title was head of R&D, but primarily it was head of research and development for front end primarily. In that ancient world, our lives revolved around Adobe Flash and Macromedia Flash before that. And wow, that's 20 years. That's crazy.
It's a long time. You know what was interesting about that company is that it was run very much like a factory in the sense that we were pumping out code, we were writing and designing sites for auto dealerships. But it was the only time I've ever worked at a tech company that you promptly started at your desks at 8 a.m. You had a 1 hour break and then you were done at 5 and you just kind of like pushed all day long. there wasn't a whole lot of opportunity to just, I don't know, relax and hang out with your colleagues. So there was no coffee room or coffee break area, but we did have Call of Duty. Remember?
Oh yeah.
We used to play hours of Call of Duty during our lunch breaks and after our sessions, our days were over. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that that company had a lot of rigid rules in some aspects and then was very lenient in others. I learned a lot, from that 2005 is when you started, and 2006 is when I started Lynchpin. That was when I was just about to transition out, and I was starting to lay the groundwork of, resigning. It's really funny because earlier today, I told the team that I was going to be doing this podcast, and they started sending me, "Oh, I met you when I listened to this podcast." And they sent me a podcast that I did for a local Rhode Island little podcast. And then another team member was like, "I met you when you spoke at this WordCamp." And then another team member was like, "I met you when you spoke at the keynote of this other WordCamp." And I realized that a lot of the team, even though I don't do this often, a lot of the team has found me through like these kind of different like avenues. And I just find that that's really interesting that I said today, I'm doing a podcast. Maybe I can find another team member like to join.
I was just going to say, are we going to segue into, are you hiring right now?
Yeah, we're pretty nimble. We're around 8 to 10 heads total as a company. But if there is an individual that can join the team and really flourish, sometimes we have to think about it from a budget standpoint and what can we afford, with healthcare and salaries and those benefits. But yeah, we're always looking, especially at this time. When we talk about like hobbies and things I'm into, like the block interactivity API is a huge part of what we've been doing. So that's something like if you're interested in that and you're looking to join a smaller agency that does a lot of WordPress work and you're interested in that, I wouldn't mind someone applying for sure.
Let's get into the meat of the podcast here and talk a little bit about some of the work you're working on, Aaron. And a good segue there might be when you are, approaching a new client, whether it's higher education or not, do they care at all if you're distributed? Does it matter to them? Does the conversation even come up?
Honestly, most of our clients, the only time they worry about us being distributed is typically, hey, who's going to answer the phone if something's wrong? Who's going to answer an email? And to that, it kind of benefit, now like with the team being distributed, we have a team member that, is on mountain time, and we've had, team members that is Italy or in Hawaii or in California, alleviate some of those concerns. I think it's sometimes
you make it an advantage rather than a disadvantage.
Yeah. I think sometimes there's a stigma of like older people in tech having this thought that distributed means like farmed out or offshored. So some of that is, again, educating, a prospect or a client on, no, the team that you're paying is doing the work. It's not a vendor. We're not going out to someone else to do that work. And then they kind of understand because they actually like meet the team. It's not just a PM, like they speak to the developers or designers or myself. And, we're pretty personable, so that helps. It also helps that we're pretty small too. It's, it's one of those things where there's a lot of faces that touch a project, and usually it's pretty much everybody touches a project at some point, where again, if you're a larger agency, that's just more value for you. Like, hey, if your team's in the UK, we have people that are in the UK. If you're in Australia, you're in, Singapore, it doesn't matter. Like, and that again, I think that's a positive thing.
Yeah, that's great.
With the caveat, I still miss it. But I think that's because I'm old. I'm just old. So I am that traditionalist in that sense.
If you're old, then I'm old too. So let's not go down that road. All right, so let's talk about higher education. If you had a university coming to you today to send you an RFP or something like that, what would you do to start scoping out the size of that project? How would you get a better understanding of what it is that they actually think they need?
So with higher education, typically they are a bit more prepared than, say, just a smaller business with maybe there's a marketing manager. With higher education, especially if they have state funding at any level, they're going to have an RFP and it will go out to bid. Now, they might have vendor preference, like they may really like the agency that's working with them today. But that still will have to go out to bid just because of certain like rules and regulations. For example, in the state of Connecticut and Rhode Island and Massachusetts, there are portals that every agency or freelancer can sign up for. And in that, they'll have an RFP. They'll have their, set things that they really want in your proposal or your statement of work. So that's usually the driving, force. Step one is usually submitting questions. And a lot of the questions are the same pretty much every time. So one of our questions would be, if no one already asked this, would be, are you okay with WordPress? If we presented that as as part of our solution, is that cool? Sometimes it's not. Sometimes that's a non-starter because maybe that organization already has a huge investment in Drupal. And that's okay. For those, we say, all right, it's not for us, but maybe there's an agency that does that. And if, it's a small community around here of, agencies and smaller shops. So usually we'll extend an olive branch and be like, hey, have you seen this?
Do higher education institutions typically favor open source, not necessarily just WordPress, but open technologies like Drupal, WordPress, things like that? Or do you see them also using closed networks as well?
Yeah, it typically has to do with, yes, I would say that more often than not, they're favoring an open source solution. Mainly that's because the talent acquisition for them is going to be easier than, say, if you use something like Craft or tried to go towards like another like hosted solution. And we can kind of speak to kind of some of those decisions that at least we've seen from our experiences. But other things we're going to look at for higher education, what does their current infrastructure look like? Do they actually have IT staff that are familiar with web? Because sometimes they don't. Sometimes it's, hey, we make sure email's working. We make sure that the VPN is working. We make sure that the Wi-Fi, access points are all rocking and rolling. However, when it gets to the web, sometimes IT may be 100% hands off outside of DNS entries.
But are they still making the decision about who to host with?
Sometimes they do. Sometimes it's up to marketing, and we find that sometimes it's trying to help higher ed understand like governance. So governance is a big thing in higher education. And it's really, for those who are listening that aren't really familiar with that, it's basically just trying to make sure that all stakeholders at whatever level, whether it's, people in a specific, department, whether it's marketing or IT/engineering, whether it's administrations, whether it's board members, every one of those roles is really important. And every one of those roles should be, respected and heard. And really, it's also about, who's responsible, one, for the decision making, but two, for the implementation. And sometimes with web, what we have found is sometimes it's really hard for a university to say who should own this thing and who should be responsible for it. Because you think about it, traditionally, most websites are marketing pieces, right? Like, especially they could be as simple as like brochureware for a small business, that's just trying to get leads. But ultimately, sometimes it's a bit of a challenge for, a university, especially smaller ones, to understand, hey, who are the stakeholders? Because there could be a lot of them. And, who is responsible again for the hosting decisions, for even ancillary services, because there's a lot of services that are needed in higher education. And some of them are 100% out of marketing's control or IT's control, et cetera.
Yeah. Well, that's a great point. It's something that we have to do anytime that we're working in business development or partnerships as well. You want to identify the folks who are going to be making those decisions and have the power to do that. Yeah. So how about the actual project itself? Is it, do hosting companies come with their own ideas on how to solve for things, or do they kind of just speak to the solutions that they need, or rather the end result, and let you decide?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that we sometimes come across, even if it's a new bid, is legacy debt. Sometimes we don't actually get a choice initially. Say we're getting our foot in the door, and this has happened historically. Let's say another agency has built a solution, and that solution isn't necessarily what the client wanted, and we're there to kind of help. And we haven't even bid on this. They've come to us for this. Sometimes we have a challenge where we're inheriting where the site is hosted, and maybe that hosting solution isn't performing well. But is that the hosting being the issue? Is that how it was built being the issue? So there's that technical debt and that legacy debt. I would say if it's a brand new bid and this is pretty rare where there isn't that, I would say that the first thing we try to look at when we're determining like how we host is, with higher education, there's sometimes peaks and valleys. Enrollment is a very important thing. So when that's happening, there's a few things we need to take into account. When we think about the catalog of like courses and programs that most educational facilities have, we want to look at like, hey, when do enrollments happen? Is it, annually? Are there trimesters? What's the matriculation look like? And also, what does commencement look like? What do events look like? Because those can really impact that traffic that happens. And, sometimes, if it's hosting and maybe, again, IT is involved and they're paying for the hosting because it's like budget, they may say like, oh my God, enrollment is like this. So we need this crazy tech stack because enrollment's going to be crazy. But the rest of the year, they're not scaling down for the valleys, right? So what we try to do is look at that from an historical knowledge, from like analytics. And that would be in the question. So when I mentioned previously, like, hey, you get to like, ask some questions prior to the process. Those are things that we would look at as much as they can share, of course, because sometimes they're not going to share all those intimate details about like traffic and those types of things. But that's definitely something we're going to ask. And that way we can make the right decision when we're, recommending a host, because ultimately, most of the time, we don't select the host for them. We're giving them the best information in order to make an informed decision. Because ultimately, we don't pay the bill, they do. So it's not really our choice, it's their choice.
How often, well, you mentioned, sometimes is it, based on if they're coming to you with an issue and of something that's already been created, and it comes down to, well, is it due to how it's been built or due to the hosting? I guess how common is it that the main solution there is to get a better host?
I would say less often that it's just the host in this day and age. I think most higher eds are making at least a slightly informed decision. There are big names in the space now, comparatively to, I would say, underperforming shared hosting like that. I think that happens a lot less now than it did, say, like 5 years ago. And that's just a more educated, I'll say consumer in air quotes, but there's more people in the space, and with WordPress being so ubiquitous, it makes it a little bit easier to like pick a host, especially when you can even see commercials for hosts, like when you're watching YouTube nowadays, which I get inundated with, like based on how I browse the web. So that's one thing that it happens a lot though in smaller business. So when we're working with small and medium businesses, hosting is almost always going to be a solution when it comes to performance, because it's a quick turnaround versus like if we're investigating it being a hodgepodge of plugins and just like maybe not necessarily performing in terms of like queries or other technical kind of engineering details that I won't get into.
Right.
So one of the things that I think about when I think about higher education is that it's not as simple as just building a one-time website. Even if you have a complex e-commerce platform, or you're trying to do something crazy with like auction sites or whatever, you're still building a website. But with higher education, you could have the marketing website, you could have a different website for admissions, you might have a network of sites where each student can sign up and build a website. You can get into internal like intranet type sites for classes and colleges inside the university. So when you typically see a new higher education opportunity, are you thinking about it from that angle, like trying to take on everything at once, or are you trying to come in and solve for one problem at a time?
I would say I'm pretty pragmatic about the things that we can accomplish, especially when it comes to budgets. I would love, just like any business owner, I would love everything. Give us every problem you could possibly have, and we can come up with a solution for it. But I think that again, if a smaller university is coming to us with, say, a $65,000 budget for their main marketing website for their EDU, it's going to be pretty much impossible for us to say like, oh, let's take on admissions, right? Because they probably do have a solution for that. Now, what we try to do though is we still like to plan out how can the website take advantage of these other platforms. Is there an API available so we can aggregate some of that? Maybe again, I talk about the catalog, right? Can we aggregate the actual master's programs? Can we get the calendar of XYZ thing, right? So we try to make sure that the website itself, the marketing site, is the main hub for that at least the communication and the marketing aspect of it. Now, if that means they still need to go off to an admissions website, that those things are going to happen. That's pretty common in the space. However, what we do like to do though is say like, okay, if we have to go to all these points because they're all important, what can we do to alleviate that for, a student that's just trying to find something, or a parent that is looking for information about financial aid? What we try to do is say like, how can we make that easier? So things like single sign-on, like that's a really important thing. And that's a pretty universal thing that most higher ed will want to try to do. For governance, right? We want to keep track of who's logging in, where they're logging in, what they have control over. And that's something that, is one of those things that in a $65K budget, which I'm just a random number that's relatively low from that standpoint, that's something we try to look for. We try to look for those solutions that are wins for the client.
Yeah, it's a great way to go about it. In our last episode, we had Jim Groom on from Reclaim Hosting. He also focuses on higher education. You have a diverse portfolio. But one of the things that we learned about there is that like right now, for example, it's November. So a lot of managers of websites or hosting companies are thinking about Black Friday and the influx of traffic that e-commerce websites are going to get. And so one of the things that we talked about in that episode was the fact that when students are coming into the school for the first time at the first semester, the first week, there's an influx of traffic. There's people signing up for classes. There's a variety of things happening all at once. And you just talked about it, the mountains and the valleys, and how hosting companies, or rather the higher education institutions, should be thinking about that. So when you think about scale in terms of within their own user base, and especially since a lot of these people are going to be logging in and not be maybe on the edge or cached as much as a typical user on the outside of a website might be, how do you start to think about that? How do you start to think about scale for an institution like that?
the first thing that we look at, even before it gets down to hardware and how it's hosted, is we look at the actual application level itself. That's really our starting point. And how cacheable is the site is something it's really important. When we look at like WooCommerce, for example, when we look at being logged into the WordPress admin or being a user that has a session, right? Those are all really big challenges. So when we think about having like uncached hits, let's say there's no Cloudflare, there's no web application firewall, there's no object cache, right? No Redis, right? We try and look at, well, what is making the site not perform well? Again, the easy ones are, well, there's a ton of plugins that are doing a lot of things, and maybe those don't really need to be there actively, right? Maybe we don't need, there's a plugin I love, Query Monitor, but not every site needs to have that on in the admin every time because it's doing a lot of stuff and you're getting a lot of useful information, but maybe it's not needed. Maybe it's not needed at a certain level. Like, hey, do we, from a governance standpoint, do we really need 30 admins, or are we really looking at 2 admins and the rest are editors, right? So what we try to look at is not only from a plugin standpoint, but then what is the site's functionality? And are we actually doing an effective job of, whether it be static assets, whether it be, expensive queries, and how we can utilize cache for that, like whether it's WP cache or transients. Those are all the things that are going to be a baseline of like any project that we inherit. Typically, if it's a project where we didn't bid on it and someone is reaching out to us, 99 times out of 100, it's the performance of the site is bad. Now, most of the time, it's not a hosting issue anymore, right? For higher ed anyway. It usually is, a thought process and how the site was developed. And we kind of work through that technical debt, that legacy debt. But sometimes it can be, we had a larger nonprofit in Massachusetts come to us because they had a smaller 2-person shop that took on a project that was too big for them. It was just too big it was originally a multi-site that all the sites basically used the same parent theme, but they had different offshoot child themes. But ultimately, every design was all really different, dramatically different. So they were kind of inheriting stuff from a parent theme, all look different anyway. So that functionality would probably better suited in a plugin that could be, toggled on or off depending on features. And the site was going down constantly for them. And the site was hosted on a single VPS that was not configured because it's a small 2-person team and they have 1 designer, 1 developer. The developer is not a sysadmin. They're not in DevOps. They don't really understand how to configure Redis, let alone all the other things.
Sure, and that just falls on them anyways sometimes, right? Like, because they think just because you can build a website, you can fix my printer, it means you can also run the server.
Exactly. And they think that they're making the right decision in terms of going to a multi-site, right? And they're like, okay, we can manage all the updates and we can do all this thing just from like one, WP admin, network admin area. And come to find out, there's a lot of performance implications with multi-site. There's a lot of configuration that you need to do to make it performant, let alone just understanding, hey, I have 120 plugins installed because I have 5 or 6 different sites on it, and they all have different needs. Maybe 2 of them are WooCommerce, the other 3 or 4 aren't WooCommerce, but we still have all this like technical debt and these challenges of updating. And that one client moving from just having a VPS on a host, quite frankly, that I'd never heard of up until obtaining the client, literally switching them to, one of the, bigger name hosts immediately made a difference because it was configured. Honestly, just a basic configuration of any sort
Yeah.
of scalable managed hosting is going to make an immediate impact on the performance of the site. And that's just going from just I won't even say misconfigured like lamp stack, a non-configured lamp stack. And that makes a huge difference, you know?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
And you're touching on something I'm super passionate about, Josh. I'm going to let you ask that question,
Yeah.
but I do want to stay on this point around multi-site.
Yeah. Well, that's what I was going to bring up is I really want to dig into multi-site a bit here. Before doing that, we don't really have to dig into the weeds too much and dig too much into the technical details. But, you brought up a good point about cacheability. That's something that we see a lot, when I'm working with hosts on WP Cloud is, navigating caching challenges. We include a lot on WP Cloud by default. It's all built in. They still deal with large stores and even some education websites where caching is still a factor because they have unique situations. As you mentioned, you got all these students logging in, you have all these sessions going on. So I'm just curious, again, we don't have to dig too deep, but like how do you approach, a situation where you've got pretty much all these students logging into the site, a lot of uncacheable requests there. What kind of things are you doing or navigating to kind of bring caching where possible or to just make the performance a little bit better given that they're logged in?
Yeah, again, I look at, one of the things that we found when working with, non-cache results were not so much the initial like page hits and things like that. It's ancillary things that are happening behind the scenes. Whether it be like notifications, whether it be other statuses that are happening. And this kind of happens with like WooCommerce as well. I think hosts have done a lot to work within like the actual, like the live cart and those types of things and
Yeah.
that checkout process. So we do really try to rely on what is actually static, what is actually happening when that session happens. Because there still are a lot of areas that, while they're not fully static, there are a ton of aspects of sites. And I think that there are larger universities that deal with that maybe a little bit more than we do, because I think our kind of bread and butter are kind of like smaller university and smaller higher ed. So we haven't necessarily need to deal with that as much as maybe the other gentleman that Jesse mentioned earlier.
Jim Groom, yeah.
Yeah, Jim, where Jim's in it and he's heavily into it. I think most of our clientele, the biggest areas like admissions or whatnot, we've been more involved in the integration of it versus having to deal with the brunt of that. Where we find the most traffic that we have to deal with, yes, is during like enrollment, but a lot of it's commencement, especially once COVID happened and so many people weren't going to the ceremonies. They were trying to catch them remote. And we found that even now, traffic is usually pretty high on commencement. And what we try and do is look at like, okay, how can we make these like landing pages that people are visiting? How can we make those highly cacheable? How can we eliminate someone even having a session on those types of things? I think that's where we get a little bit more creative in solving that.
No, that's interesting. Yeah, looking at it from that perspective. When we think about multi-site, there's a lot that you get for free with it. We talked about this in the last episode as well, but we just touched on it. And I love the idea of talking about multi-site in 2024 because I started working on it 15 years ago. And at the time, it was, you got so much for free. You got, plugin management, you got theme management, you got the ability to update everything with one hit. You got user management, free things in terms of security because you could put up guardrails and prevent people from doing things. But now, 15 years later, we're looking at it from a different perspective. With WP Cloud, for example, the way in which we can roll out updates across an entire account allows for us to do that with like symlink files, and then everything is essentially getting the same power that you'd get from multi-site, but you're doing it with single sites. We still run into some issues, right? Because multi-site user management makes it really easy to assign individuals a single username and password into a variety of websites. But you can still solve for that today, right? Like there are SSO solutions. You mentioned single sign-on. There's other ways to compensate for that. So when you think about, multi-site and a large network, Are you thinking about it from the perspective of like we have that as an option, we're going to go with multi-site, or maybe we don't and we use something else? Or is it really just when you run into customers who are asking for these types of things, multi-site is pretty much the default still?
I would say that over I'll say the last 3 years or so, I haven't had a single client come to me and say, we need a multi-site.
Wow.
And really I think with the times, for us, for Linchpin, for example, most of our clients, even if we said, oh, we're going to auto update everything, right? We're going to use machine learning. We're going to run the updates, do visual regression testing. If it fails, we'll roll it back, right? Like, even if we say we're going to do all those things, most of our clients, because we're a concierge service, we're the ones doing that. We're the ones that are rolling out those updates. I think when it comes to clients of ours that we would propose multi-site, the first thing I look at is what is the purpose of that. So I can speak to a client that we had previously that had an over 1,000 site multi-site setup, and we didn't build it out. Again, it was an inherited project that was having performance issues because, well, it was 1,000 site multi-site instance. And that challenge for them was they had loan officers that they had basically microsites of the main site, and that they wanted to give them the ability to have a few pages that they could customize, and they would have that sole role to do that. So for them, it was governance, right? Like, hey, we have these loan officers. They can only control their site. The template, everybody got the same exact template, right? So the branding of it was exactly the same. There were no child, themes. And that's how they handled their governance. So everybody got a login, and they could, as an admin, you can manage everybody's stuff, and you're managing the updates for plugins. I think that's a great, if you need to do that and you need that level, I think that's a great solution. However, I think in this day and age, I would also think about it from a region standpoint, and like how it's being cached and how it's being served up at the edge. I'd also be thinking about, like, does this really need to be a multi-site? Like, do we need individual domains for users? From the SEO standpoint, is there a lot of redundant content across these? Should this better be suited as a directory? Like, I'm just using this project as an example of how I would rethink it nowadays. I think more so with being able to roll out updates and being able to actually have a better deployment process for that. I think it makes it less and less of a viable solution, for most clients. But there's always that scenario where, like, it would break my heart if ever it was not a thing, just because so many people worked on it, and I think that it's still a viable thing. But for us, we're not really proposing that too often anymore.
Yeah, makes sense. I mean, I love multi-site. It was a very important tool, and something that I used many times early in my career to help us solve for a lot of problems. But I think the way I look at it now is that, simple things like a must-use plugin, for example, can be leveraged to do something like, with higher education sites, you'll see that we want to put a banner up. You mentioned commencement, right? Like, everyone's graduating next week. You got to be out of the dorms. It's the type of message you would see at the top of every single website in a multi-site network. But a must-use plugin that's used across an entire network of single sites can do the same kind of thing. There's SSO tools to help with the management of users across many different sites, so you get the same tools. SSH and CLI can be used for super admin powers, even though it's not like an official super admin within a network. So I think it's really important that we start to think about the power that you get from multi-site and what you can replace that with, and what you get for free, and what you can actually what other advantages you can take from single sites. I think right out of the gate, single sites give you a performance upgrade. I mean, we talked a little bit about the complications with networks, sharing a database, having concurrent users across the entire network all at the same time, pulling the same data. Single sites get you a lot of stuff for free. You can allocate different resources. A student website, for example, may only need a single worker, whereas the marketing website for the admissions team might need, to be able to compensate for 50,000 visitors a month, something like that.
Yeah, that's a very valid point when it comes to the workers. It's a term that not a lot of people like outside of our sphere
Yeah.
really think about, but it really does come down to how much things can be processed at the same time and how many workers are available. And to your point, with a student site or something as simple as we have one of our clients that has a dedicated site for their map, an interactive map, because once enrollment happens and students, they may have gotten a tour, but a lot of times they don't really know where to go, right? But that's not really necessarily a really busy site per se, but it does need to be performant. Most users are going to be on their phone looking around, and they're going to be trying to find, hey, I need to get to this office, I need to get to this class. And yeah, it may
There's
not need
no
a lot
worse
of
time
workers.
for a site to load slowly when you're lost, right?
Yeah, exactly, right? And so that's a thing when we talk about scalable hosting, that's something where that performance matters, especially maybe they are trying to get to they're lost and they're trying to find the nurse and trying to get some help. That's one of those things that those things do matter for sure.
Yeah, performance and scalability. As I work with partners and hosts who are really trying to build out specific solutions for their end customers for WP Cloud, it really comes down for me is our main discussion on whether or not multi-site's a good solution. Even though we do support it, comes down to scalability and performance. There's so much built into WP Cloud in terms of the ability of, scaling up your PHP workers as needed. And we offer bursting that goes up to 110 workers. And actually here soon, it looks like we're going to go well beyond that in our next generation of hardware. So kind of navigating.
We're letting some
a little drop in a little
features.
something.
That's great. I like it. Yeah.
Now, when you have one site that can take advantage of that bursting up to 110, or if you decide you want to do a multi-site and pack it with 100, 200, 500 sites, on our end, it's still treated as a single site. So it's going to have that same burst limit of 110 workers. So it's really trying to navigate, okay, how can we solve for some of the things they want to do? And when it comes down to, we want all of these themes to be available on all of this segment of sites. We want these plugins to be available by default on these segment of sites. We've worked really hard on WP Cloud to kind of build in some of those features, just for general day-to-day management, but they can be definitely used by multi-site operations, saying, hey, you can have these on there by default. They actually don't take up any additional storage the way that we manage and symlink them to a file system. At least they don't take up storage on these individual sites, very similar to a multi-site situation. And then how you manage updates and how you want to do that, it's very controlled. And to the point to where those plugins also can't be edited. So if you've got someone who shouldn't have admin maybe on somewhere and they just say, hey, I want to slip this into this plugin, we can actually work with you to kind of lock that down. So I think we do have a lot of people with strong opinions come in. They love multi-site. I don't blame them, but it's more of, okay, let's really navigate this to make sure it is a good fit for your situation.
Sure.
And let's also weigh these other benefits that we have with WP Cloud.
Yeah. Well, you touched on something there that I keep going back to over and over again, which is that when you have a multi-site network, and maybe this has changed, correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not as involved in the development of sites as I used to be, but if you have 1,000 sites and one of them is absolutely crucial to your business and the core competency of what it is that you're offering, and then a bunch of them are ancillary things that, if they do have a little bit of downtime here and there, it's not the end of the world. But that entire network is sharing the same amount of resources. And so if you get one of those sites absolutely slammed, and they're taking away those resources, every site on that network is suffering from that. And I believe that's still, a true statement. Correct me if I'm wrong, Dave.
Yeah, and the typical setup, yeah.
Yeah, so having these multi-sites broken up into different single sites allow for you to have granular control over the resource allocation for those things. So it's something really, important to think about, that if you're going for multi-site, to be able to compensate for the management of thousands of websites and users and people, doing a variety of different things. And you're thinking you're getting a lot for free with multi-site, which technically you do. You're still also, setting yourself up to have to compensate for a lot of performance management, and compensation for that.
Yeah, we call it the noisy neighbor, right?
Oh, yeah.
So you're having to deal with, they're all connected, they're all this neighborhood, right? And we have to deal with that. Sometimes even with hosting in general, right? So there's so many providers out there that, like a smaller agency, they can pick a package that can host 10 sites, 25 sites, 100 sites, or whatever happens to be. But a lot of times those, again, are just on a specific, Docker container with whatever host it is. And then they're getting all of their individual sites, but they're still technically on most of the time, not on like a clustered environment, right?
Yeah.
Most of the time it's just on, again, a VPS somewhere that wherever it's really hosted out of, like Amazon or Google or DigitalOcean or whatever. And they're trying to sell as many sites onto like that account to make that hosting revenue, right? And whether it's multi-site and there's that one big multi-site that's on there and it's consuming all of those resources, or it's an e-commerce site that maybe again is expensive, you kind of have to deal with all those performance things. And I think that with solutions, again, like Pressable and WP Cloud, it's like they're able to kind of offset that kind of the idea of like the noisy neighbor. And that's something that's really intriguing to like agencies like Linchpin. I always am thinking about that. It's really important. Uptime's important. Response time's really important to those things. And again, I think application level that like kind of impacts that. It's not to say that a site can't be incorrectly developed, but it's something we really think about, especially that noisy neighbor, because it does come up. We had actually, we still to this day still have a multi-site that we basically transferred every client of ours that was on this multi-site for ease of use. We have transferred off into their own individual sites, right? And we called it the Hive, so the Linchpin Hive. And we had all these cells in the Hive, and we just treated every site like that. And we the same idea. We had these plugins we want every client to have. The tried and true, like we're going to have the Yoast of the world on there. We're going to have Gravity Forms. We're going to have a Jetpack. We're going to have all these ones that plugins we trust. That's the suite that we're going to give you. And at first we found it to be easy. All right. But then all of a sudden, again, you have a site that maybe has a lot of plugins it's using, but not everybody else is taking advantage of. So they got to go on their own, right? They should be on their own hosting solution. They should be on their own site, so that's an argument to like kind of maybe diversify and like move them off, right? And then, so we've done that. We've like kind of moved everybody off of that, except for one. There's literally one client that like is in this multi-site still to this day. That
Nice.
we've reached out to, and just like it's not necessarily a big deal. We've actually sunset every other site, and like that database doesn't have all that overhead anymore. But technically speaking, that site is still technically a multi-site. Because I would forgot what ID they are in there, but like we map the database to like the WP whatever site ID it was at the time, right? So I think it's just a transition to the world as it stands today, and like how scalability is just different. I find that to be really interesting that you mentioned it, because we just reached out to that client like 3 weeks ago just to like hit them up, because they're kind of self-service. They kind of just do their own thing, and it's a very small site. Yeah.
Nice.
Well, maybe there's an opportunity for them with Pressable or Bluehost Cloud or another WP Cloud provider, but that'll be my only plug of the day. So with that, this was a great episode. Aaron, I would love to have you back on in the future. Josh, you'll definitely be back on occasionally here and there. Let me ask you this, Aaron. If folks want to reach out to you, if they want to apply for a job so they can say that they work for you and met you on this podcast, Where do folks go? What URLs do you want to share?
Well, you can always go to linchpin.com for sure. It's linchpins with eyes, no Y's in there. You can also hit me up on, man, I'm not really a fan of any social media, honestly. But you can hit me up on Twitter/X at Aaron Ware. It's pretty easy to find me. If you just search the web and search for Aaron Ware, you can find me. If you want to look at older podcasts, you can find me on a few podcasts on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts, or on WordPress.tv. You can see some of my sessions if you want to do that.
You're like a pro, Aaron. Look at that.
Yeah, in terms of celebrities, I think I'm like a Z-list celebrity. I'm like really, I think that's as high as I'll go.
You still got it down though. Podcasts where you podcast and all that. That's great.
Yeah.
Josh, how about you? Is there anything you want to share?
Yeah. Well, first and foremost, if you're a host, you're interested in what we're doing with WP Cloud, just jump over to wp.cloud. We've got some good information there and some ways to contact us and to start a discussion. And we've got some good case studies. I think we've got one for Pressable up right now, working on some others. So you can learn more about that. Or if you just want to reach out to me about something else, learn more about the farming or brewing and stuff we talked about, you can find me at good.pro. That's good with the E.pro.
Nice. That's great. And as always, if anybody has any follow-up questions for the crew here, you can go to impressive.host and ask your questions there, and we'll make sure to follow up. Aaron and Josh, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me. I had a blast.
Yeah, us too. All right, that was another episode about higher education with Aaron Ware and Joshua Good. It was great having them on. They taught us a lot. So let's recap. What did we learn today, kids? Well, we learned a little bit about the RFP process and the going out and getting clients around higher education. Aaron was really informative around that. So if you're trying to figure out how to get into that space, I think this episode's great for you. Some of the things that we also covered around this episode were around governance and the importance that higher education institutions have or place on the opportunity to let's call it micromanagement of their websites and their network. I think that's super important when you're going after higher education clients. Giving them the ability to manage user roles and plugins and themes across their network is super, super important. We also touched a lot on performance and scale and the debate about whether or not multi-site is absolutely right for the job or not. And I think there's a lot of value that comes with multi-site, but I think it's also worth exploring what WP Cloud or other solutions out there can do to help you unpack a multi-site. There's a lot you get for free from creating singular sites. We talked about the granularity of resource allocation and how you can make sure that your noisy neighbors are not causing problems for the sites around that network. So definitely take some time to consider your next multi-site project and think about whether or not another solution might be good for you. Thanks, everybody, and looking forward to the next episode.